The river is black in the winter night, and the headlights make it look like molten metal. On December 1979, Soviet armor and transport trucks roll over the Amu Darya and into Afghanistan. Confident, quiet, methodical. The kind of movement an empire does when it thinks it's solving a problem in a weekend. And if you're sitting in Washington watching that convoy cross, you don't need to win Afghanistan. You just need to make sure the Soviets can't stop losing. So here's the question that matters. How do you turn a superpower's ordinary weaknesses, bureaucracy, stagnation, pride, into a chain reaction it can't control without firing on it directly? By the end of this, you'll see exactly how this war turned Soviet weakness into a fatal chain reaction. Afghanistan mattered for one simple reason. It sat in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was on the USSR's soft underbelly, right next to Soviet Central Asia, close enough that instability didn't feel like foreign policy. It felt like infection. And in 1978, a Marxist party in Kabul seized power and started changing everything: fast land, religion, power structures, without the state capacity to survive the backlash. Here's the detail. Most summaries skip. The Soviet Union didn't walk into a calm country and create a war. Afghanistan was already tearing at the seams: factional infighting in Kabul, rural revolts, assassinations, mutinies. Moscow watched its client regime wobble and saw a familiar nightmare: an ally collapsing and your credibility collapsing with it. So why did Washington pay attention? Because in the late 1970 seconds, the United States had just taken a series of strategic gut punches: Vietnam's hangover, Iran's revolution, the hostage crisis. And then the Soviets moved troops into a country Americans already associate with graveyard of empires. It looked like both a threat and an opportunity. Hold on to that. The opportunity wasn't Afghanistan itself. It was what Afghanistan could do to the Soviet system. So let's be plain about the thesis. The United States did not single-handedly cause the Soviet collapse. That story is too neat, too cinematic, and honestly too flattering to everyone involved. Lakin, the US helped shape the conditions that made Afghanistan long, costly, politically toxic, and strategically unwinnable. And that mattered because the Soviet Union entered the 1980 seconds with deep existing weaknesses: economic stagnation, brittle legitimacy, a political culture allergic to admitting failure. Afghanistan didn't invent those problems. It converted them into a crisis. Here's the pivot point. You don't have to break a rival's strengths if you can force it to live inside its weaknesses. And Afghanistan was exactly that kind of war. Here's where it turns, because this is the part people argue about the most. Was Afghanistan a trap? You've probably heard the spicy version. Washington lured the USSR into its own Vietnam on purpose, smiling while the bear walked into the snare. There is a real reason this idea won't die. Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, later bragged in an interview that US support to Afghan opponents of the Kabul regime began before the Soviet invasion, and implied the goal was to raise the odds the Soviets would step in. Some people take that as a confession of a deliberate trap. Others point out that the early aid was limited, the Soviets had their own reasons, and the idea that Moscow invaded because of a small covert program doesn't fit how Soviet decision-making actually worked. So what's supported? It's supported that the US began some covert assistance to Afghan resistance elements before December 1979, and that after the invasion, Washington massively expanded support through the CIA program, often called Operation Cyclone, because the invasion reframed everything. What's debated is intent and causality. Did the US design a baited hook to pull the USSR across the border, or did it see a fire start and decide to feed it oxygen? Some argue the trap was deliberate from the beginning. Others disagree and say the Soviets intervened primarily because the Kabul regime was collapsing and because Moscow feared the political contagion of a hostile, unstable Afghanistan on its border. But let me give you the most defensible version, the one that doesn't require mind reading. Afghanistan wasn't a trap at the moment the Soviets entered. It became one once they were inside. That's the part most people miss. Traps don't have to be pre-built. In geopolitics, you can build the trap around someone after they've stepped into the room. And the Soviet Union gave Washington the room. So why didn't the Soviets just leave once it got ugly? Because leaving isn't a military decision. It's a political confession. The Soviet leadership told itself a story in 1979 and 1980. This is a limited intervention to stabilize a friendly government. A fraternal mission. A quick operation. A problem you solve with force and advisors. But Afghanistan punished that kind of thinking immediately. The terrain is not just mountains. It's fragmentation. Villages with their own loyalties, networks that don't map onto the state. The Kabul government's authority thins out the moment you leave the road. And the resistance wasn't one organization you could decapitate. It was a shifting swarm of groups with local legitimacy and external sanctuaries. So the Soviets leaned into what they knew. Mechanized operations, air assault, firepower, control of cities and main routes. And in the short term, it worked. Kabul stayed up. The roads were contested but usable. The regime survived. But there was a bigger problem. A war can be winnable on paper and still be strategically unwinnable because the thing you're protecting is itself rotten. The Afghan communist state was riven by factionalism. Its army had desertions and low morale. Its authority depended on Soviet muscle. That meant every Soviet success reinforced the same dependency that made success impossible. So Moscow kept paying, and Washington watched the payment schedule with interest. Because once you understand sunk costs, you understand empires. The deeper the Soviets went, the more reasons they found not to admit the original decision was wrong. Every year of sacrifice becomes an argument for more sacrifice. Every dead soldier becomes a political hostage. We can't leave now. What would it mean? And it wasn't only pride. It was fear. Fear of what withdrawal would signal to allies. Fear of what it would signal inside the USSR's own Muslim-majority republics. Fear of the message it would send to the West about Soviet power. Fear that the Kabul regime would collapse instantly and the Soviets would look weak on their own border. So the war turns into a machine that runs on credibility. And once it runs on credibility, you can't turn it off without humiliation. Here's the mini cliffhanger. Washington didn't need to invent that machine. It just needed to make sure it kept running and getting more expensive with every lap. This is the part people miss. External support doesn't just add bullets. It changes the geometry of a war. If you imagine an insurgency as a fire, local grievances are the sparkwood. But money, training, logistics, and safe havens, that's airflow. And airflow turns a small fire into something that can eat oxygen from an entire region. After 1979, the US, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and others, each with their own motives, helped build a pipeline. The CIA wasn't shipping weapons straight to every fighter. Much of the support moved through Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, which shaped distribution based on its own priorities. That detail matters, because it means American control was never total, and the resistance itself was never a single coherent instrument. So what did the support actually do? First, it stabilized the resistance as an institution. Insurgencies die when they can't feed themselves, when commanders can't pay men, when ammunition runs dry, when injuries and losses can't be replaced. External support makes continuity possible. It keeps the fighters in the field season after season. Second, it professionalized parts of the fight. Training, communications gear, and intelligence support can turn spontaneous rebellion into sustained operations. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but enough to force the occupier to react. Third, and this is where the math turns brutal, it shifted cost. A guerrilla doesn't need to win battles. It needs to keep the war going at a price the occupier can't politically justify. External support makes that easy. You can lose rifles and replace them. The occupier loses helicopters and cannot. So now the Soviets aren't just fighting Afghan fighters. They're fighting supply routes, border sanctuaries, and an enemy that can absorb punishment and reappear. Safe havens matter more than heroism. If you can cross a border, rest, refit, train, and return, you don't have to hold ground. You just have to survive. And the Afghan-Pakistan border, with its geography and politics, made that survival possible. So the Soviets tried to do what many armies try: seal the border. And that's where the geometry becomes a nightmare. To seal a mountainous, porous border, you need manpower. You need persistent surveillance. You need local allies who don't betray you. You need time. And every one of those requirements collided with Soviet reality. They increased troop numbers, intensified operations, used air power to strike valleys and routes. They mined, raided, and swept. But the sanctuary problem never goes away, and every failed attempt to solve it becomes another reason to escalate. Now, you've heard about the Stinger missile. Let's treat it with the respect it deserves without turning it into magic. The Stinger arrived in significant numbers in 1986. It didn't suddenly win the war for the Mujahideen, but it did something strategically important. It attacked a Soviet strength that was covering multiple weaknesses. Soviet air power, helicopters, close air support, mobility was how they compensated for unreliable Afghan ground forces and for terrain that punished heavy armor. Air power moved troops fast, supplied outposts, evacuated wounded, and punished ambushes. So when shoulder-fired missiles made low-flying aircraft far riskier, it wasn't just about shooting down helicopters. It was about slowing the whole machine. Pilots fly higher. That reduces accuracy. It reduces the psychological presence of air power. It makes medevac harder. It makes resupply more dangerous. It forces more movement by ground, which increases exposure to ambushes and mines. And morale? Morale changes fast when a weapon shows up that makes the occupier bleed in a visible way. Here's the missing detail line. The Stinger's biggest effect wasn't only tactical, it was informational. If you're a Soviet conscript and you've been told the Soviet army is unstoppable, and then you watch a helicopter spin into a mountainside because someone in sandals can reach the sky, that story spreads. If you're an Afghan fighter and you've watched years of air assault and gunship terror, and suddenly you can hit back, that story spreads too. And Washington understood the power of stories, because in a long war, stories are policy. But there was a bigger problem for Moscow. Every new layer of external support forced the Soviets to spend more to maintain the same level of control. More sorties, more security, more repairs, more replacements, more fuel, more bribes, more political management. The war becomes like holding a heavy door shut while the pressure behind it keeps rising. You can keep it closed for a while, but your arms start shaking. Hold on to that shaking, because it's about to meet the Soviet economy. Here's the mini cliffhanger. The battlefield didn't have to defeat the USSR. It just had to make the USSR act like a defeated state spending, concealing and improvising. Here's where the war hits the USSR, where it's already fragile. The Soviet Union could survive a hard year. It could survive a humiliating incident. It could even survive a costly military program. What it struggled to survive was sustained exposure, year after year, to a problem that demanded flexibility, truth-telling, and efficient trade-offs. Because those are exactly the things the late Soviet system was worst at. Start with the economy. Afghanistan wasn't the sole reason the Soviet economy was in trouble. The rot was older. Low productivity growth, technological lag, rigid planning, poor incentives, a massive defense industrial complex that produced impressive weapons and unimpressive consumer life. So what does war do to a system like that? It doesn't just cost money, it creates distortions. War demands spare parts on time. It demands transport capacity. It demands high-quality maintenance. It demands supplies moved across vast distances. It demands medical care, fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment. It demands hard currency for things the Soviet Union can't easily produce efficiently. And this is where the math turns brutal. Planned economies can hide inefficiency in peacetime because shortages are normalized and quality is negotiable. War is less forgiving. Now add timing. In the mid-1980 seconds, global oil prices fell dramatically. Oil and gas exports were a major source of Soviet hard currency. So as the war drags on, the Soviet state has less external income to cushion internal strain. That doesn't mean Afghanistan bankrupted the USSR in a simple ledger sense. Estimates of the war's annual cost vary widely, and the Soviet economy was huge. But political economies don't die from one invoice. They die when multiple stresses overlap and leadership loses the ability to choose. Afghanistan forced choices between guns and butter, between secrecy and credibility, between staying the course and admitting weakness. And the Soviet system hated choices. Now look at manpower and morale. The Soviets relied heavily on conscripts. Young men pulled from across the Union, including from Central Asia, sent into a confusing war with unclear aims, brutal conditions, and a constant feeling of being hated by the population around them. So you get familiar pathologies: drug use, black market dealing, corruption, brutal hazing, and a creeping sense that the mission is pointless. And casualties, while not on the scale of World War II, were politically corrosive. Tens of thousands were killed and many more wounded over the decade. Even if the numbers don't break the army, they break the story the state tells about itself. Because the Soviet state's legitimacy wasn't democratic performance. It was competence. It was stability. It was the promise that the system worked. Afghanistan made the system look incompetent. Now picture the home front. In authoritarian systems, public anger doesn't have to become organized opposition to matter. It just has to become disbelief. Families receive bodies in sealed coffins. Funerals happen in whispers. Veterans return with trauma, addiction, and resentment. Men who've seen the state lie up close. The government tries censorship, tries silence. But silence is not neutral. Silence creates rumors. And rumors are a kind of uncontrolled truth. That's the part most people miss. In a closed system, information leaks act like acid. They dissolve trust faster than they spread facts. By the mid to late 1980 seconds, with glasnost, the censorship cracks widen. The war becomes discussable. And once a war becomes discussable, the state can't control how it's interpreted. So now Afghanistan isn't just a distant war. It's an argument inside Soviet society about whether the leadership is telling the truth. And then you reach the elite level. Afghanistan becomes a wedge. Some elites see it as a bleeding wound that must be cauterized. Others fear withdrawal will unravel Soviet authority everywhere. The military bureaucracy resists humiliation. The political leadership fears paralysis. The KGB has its own assessments. Regional leaders worry about domestic stability. And the longer the war goes, the more it becomes evidence in every internal debate about reform, competence, and the future. So when Gorbachev comes in, he inherits this war like a heavy stone in a backpack. He can't run forward with reforms while the stone drags behind him. But he also can't drop it without everyone watching. So why didn't he just cut support to Kabul and walk away? Because Kabul collapsing on the USSR's border would be framed as defeat. And defeat inside a brittle empire has ripple effects. In the military, in satellite states, in nationalist movements, in the perceptions of rivals. Afghanistan didn't create those fractures. It illuminated them. Here's the mini cliffhanger. If you want to understand why Afghanistan mattered, you have to see it less as a battlefield and more as a stress test that the Soviet system kept failing in public. Now let's steelman the counter-argument, because if you're smart, you're already thinking it. The Soviet Union had bigger problems than Afghanistan. Economic stagnation had been worsening for years. The price collapse in oil hit hard currency. Nationalism surged across the Union, the Baltics, the Caucasus, Ukraine, Central Asia, driven by history and fresh anger. Leadership churn in the early 1980 seconds left, the system drifting. The arms race demanded massive spending. Reform itself, perestroika and glasnost, destabilized the old controls faster than it built new legitimacy. Add disasters like Chernobyl, add a crisis of ideology, add a global system that was changing faster than Soviet institutions could adapt. So, in this view, Afghanistan is important, but not central. It's one theater among many. Some argue the USSR could have withdrawn sooner and still face collapse. Others argue the collapse was rooted in internal contradictions, and Afghanistan merely consumed headlines. That's a fair case. But here's the pivot point that reconciles it. Afghanistan did not create the rot. It accelerated the collapse by turning weakness into crisis. Think of the Soviet Union like a building with structural problems. Outdated wiring, water damage, cracks in the foundation. Those problems might sit for years without a full collapse. Afghanistan was the storm that arrives and forces every weak point to perform at once. It forced the state to spend under unfavorable conditions. It forced the state to lie and then defend its lies. It forced the state to send its sons into a war it couldn't clearly justify. It forced the leadership to choose between humiliation and endless commitment. It forced reformers and hardliners into open conflict. It forced society to notice that the system was not in control, and Washington didn't have to orchestrate every detail to benefit from that dynamic. It simply had to keep the war difficult to finish, keep the resistance alive, keep the costs rising, keep the Soviet air advantage contested, keep the sanctuaries functioning, keep the conflict politically toxic. In that sense, yes, Afghanistan became a lever, not a magic button. A lever applied to an already strained system. Hold on to that lever, because it brings us back to the river in 1979 and what that convoy didn't understand. When the Soviets crossed into Afghanistan, they entered a war that would punish the exact traits their system relied on: denial, rigidity, and prestige. They thought they were moving into a problem they could manage by force and control. But the war was never only in the valleys. It was inside the Soviet decision loop. Every month they stayed, the incentives to stay became stronger. Every weapon shipment into the resistance made staying costlier. Every coffin that returned made staying uglier. Every lie the state told made the next lie harder to maintain. And this is where you see the US role clearly, without conspiracy. Washington didn't need to control Afghanistan. It needed to control the slope. Make the slope steep enough that every Soviet step forward costs more than the last. That's what sustained external support does. It turns time into a weapon. And time is the one thing an empire spends without noticing until it can't. So when people ask, did Afghanistan collapse the Soviet Union? The honest answer is no. But it helped make collapsing feel inside the Soviet system like the path of least resistance. Because once a state can't convincingly explain why it fights, once it can't convincingly budget for its ambitions, once it can't convincingly promise competence, the rest of its problems stop being manageable. They start becoming contagious. The convoy in 1979 crossed a river thinking it was entering a country. It was entering a feedback loop. And when a superpower gets stuck in a loop, spending more to achieve less, lying more to hide failure, and doubling down because retreat feels impossible. That doesn't look like dramatic defeat. It looks like slow motion, until suddenly it isn't. Final line. Afghanistan didn't knock the Soviet Union down by itself, but it taught the Soviet system how to fall, and then made sure it couldn't catch itself.